Perfect. So while you're getting that set up, I guess I'll tell you guys a little bit about my background and how I uh, became interested in pelvic floor stuff. Um, More or less, so I'm a sports chiropractor, and I'm based out of Boston. I own and run a practice with my husband here in Boston, and I primarily work with people who have um, chronic pain, active adults. And I'm a little different from your regular chiropractor in that I mostly use exercise and resistance training to help people get from A to B, as opposed to like most chiropractors are really hands on. And um, when I actually right around the time I met Kara, I got pregnant with my oldest, and I'm now a mom of three. So I'm uh, involved in the pelvic floor stuff in more ways than one. And and when I got pregnant, I was like, "Oh, this is awesome!" I've always done all my continuing ed around training and rehab and exercise intervention to get into pelvic floor or more deeper into the pelvic floor education and understanding. I had some um, education that like baked into stuff, right? But never really focused on it. And long story short, when I started learning about the pelvic floor, not only was I trying to think of the right word here, um, unimpressed, uh, angry at the status quo of the information that's out there for like Gen Pop, like in society, our assumptions about pelvic floor. And also, I was really, um, I just felt like I was left out to dry by the medical community, by my own colleagues, by what was being put out there around training and pregnancy and training and postpartum and leaking and um, to nothing grinds my gears more than the tampon commercials or like the panty liner commercials that are like, oh, you're leaking with exercise, great, we have a solution for you. And it's like, no, like this is the last step, or like a me or a band-aid in the short term, but this is like just the way it makes it sound like this is the only thing you can do is wear black pants and a panty liner. So anyway, that's what I'm here to talk to you guys about today. Is we're basically going to take a pelvic floor 101 course today, a little chat. We're going to talk about what it is, where it is, what it does, what happens when it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. And with that focus on leaking with exercise, which the medical words for that are stress urinary incontinence. And then what we can do about that. So, and as far as I'm concerned, for stress urinary incontinence or leaking with exercise, you guys are on the front lines for this. So it's really important that we can team up here and help these people. So and also too, guys, I get really passionate about this stuff and really chatty, and like I'm gonna get lost in my slides because I love talking about this stuff. But please shout out if you have any questions. But I'm gonna save some time at the end so that to make sure we yeah, we have time for questions. And you guys can see my screen okay, right? You got a big old pelvis up there right now. Is that what you're looking at? Cool. All right. Okay, so pelvic floor. What is it? Where is it? Your pelvic floor is a group of muscles that cover your pelvic outlet, which is the very bottom of your pelvis. So if you put your hands on your hips, you feel like at the top of your hips here, you feel your iliac crest. That's the what's considered the pelvic inlet, the opening of your pelvis. And then at the bottom, I'm going to have another slide on this in a second, is your pelvic outlet. It's also referred to as the pelvic diaphragm, pelvic floor, pelvic diaphragm, they're synonymous. And the reason for that is because the function is similar in a lot of ways to your respiratory diaphragm, which is the one we're all really familiar with, that sits on top of your abdomen underneath your rib cage. And that's our main breathing muscle, right? So you'll hear pelvic floor, pelvic diaphragm, and then there's perineum, which people always are confused about. You'll hear this if you've worked with birthing people or you've birthed a baby before, or you want to birth a baby someday. Perineum is the tissue that we talk about when it comes to tearing during childbirth, and it's located between this is the urogenital hiatus, whether you're male or female, and this is a roughly uh, uh, gender neutral pelvis here. So we left out all the genitalia, but we've got the genital outlet, and then we've got this little bit of tissue in the middle, and then this is the outlet for the anus. Whoops. Let me go back there. So this little piece of tissue here is considered your perineum. And all of these muscles that you can see in pink are various pelvic floor muscles. So just to clear up some conversational bits here from the start. All right, so functional anatomy, we're going to zoom out now and take like the 10,000 foot view of the pelvic floor. And the analogy I like to use to describe where it is, and this is also going to relate to what it does, is a house, right? So your roof of your house is your respiratory diaphragm, sits under your rib cage, right up here in yellow. And notice how I color coordinated the roof of the house picture. You're welcome. And then you've got your abdominal muscles that wrap 360 degrees around. So this is your TVA, your rectus abdominis, your obliques, some of your lumbar muscles, if you're an anatomy person and you want to talk about that stuff, but it's all the muscles that go the heck way around the core. And then at the bottom here, you have your pelvic floor, which makes up the foundation of this house. And these muscles work together to control, to do a lot actually, but we're going to dive into that a little bit more in a minute. Okay. What does the pelvic floor do? What are its main functions? It has a lot. And we're not going to talk about all of these today, but I wanted to throw them up there because you can have symptoms that involve the pelvic floor in any one of these categories. And because the pelvic floor at its simplest is a skeletal muscle, right? We can train it, guys. We can load it. We can make it stronger. We can overload it, and I'll have problems there too. And primarily as coaches and trainers and people who are giving exercises to your clients, like, you have impact on all of these facets. So I'm going to briefly kind of run through them just to connect the dots if it doesn't jump out to you as far as what these might mean. But so we have the top of the list, the pelvic floor is support. So it literally holds your organs in from falling out, which sounds kind of crazy and like a little rough, but that's legitimately a problem that some people can have. It's called pelvic organ prolapse, where their bladder can start to protrude out of that urogenital hiatus and other various issues. It's a sphincter. These are muscles that also contract to help with continence. So this is your urinary incontinence, leaking with exercise, rectal incontinence, which we're going to talk about symptoms more later, but sexual function, your pelvic floor for the female or the clitoris havers of the group, your pelvic floor musculature is, or I should say your clitoris wraps around your pelvic floor musculature in the urogenital hiatus. So your ability to orgasm is related to the muscle tone that you have in your pelvic floor. And we know with exercise, we can have impact on muscle tone. So big stuff happening there. Pelvic stability, this one's kind of a no-brainer. I would say, since you guys are, this is probably where you carry the most knowledge. It's obviously not a direct pelvic stabilizer. We're not moving any joints with the pelvic floor, but it's going to help with trunk stability or play a factor, which is related to the next bullet point at the top here, managing abdominal pressure. And this is a big one as it relates to incontinence, because essentially what's happening with leaking with exercise is that there's too much pressure inside the abdomen and it's looking to escape, and it's going to take the easiest route. If that is up in our diaphragm, then we're burping or breathing or exhaling. If that's down in our pelvic floor, we're leaking, we're farting, we're having fecal issues, a whole lot of stuff. If that's in our abdomen or our core, that's a sports hernia, that's an umbilical hernia. There's just depends on which tissue we're talking about. But the challenges and how we can train this area is pretty similar. So we'll get to that. I already mentioned a little bit about breath, and we're going to dive into that in a second. And then circulation. This is a big one because your pelvic floor, again, it's that foundation of the house. And when your pelvic floor contracts, it creates a lifting motion. And when it relaxes, it creates a lowering motion of the tissues in your pelvic outlet. So that lifting and lowering also acts kind of like a sump pump. So lymphatic drainage for your pelvis, circulation for your pelvis. These are all really important things when it comes to pregnancy and childbirth and recovery, but also certain types of cancers. And if you've had major trauma to your lower extremity, this becomes really important too, which is why just another of the million reasons why bed rest is in so many scenarios not recommended after injuries, after surgery. We need to get these people moving. But that's a whole other talk. Hunter, call me back for that one. Okay, so pelvic floor function. I always like to, if I can get this video to play, I always like to play this just briefly while I talk about it because I don't know if it's going to play. But long story short, there's not much to see there. It's a person jumping on a trampoline. Often the analogy for your pelvic floor is that these muscles are a hammock, but that just leaves so much out of the story, right? Your pelvic floor muscles are, they have a certain amount of muscle tone. They are mostly reflexive and reactive, but you also can like consciously override. And the amount of contraction or reaction of your pelvic floor has a lot to do with how much pressure is being put down into them. So you can imagine like a small person on a trampoline, that trampoline's not going to move too much. A big person on a trampoline, that trampoline is going to move quite a bit. So yeah, just a little analogy there. We'll continue to unpack as we go. All right, so pelvic floor function 101. This is really important, guys. This is basis for everything that I teach all of my clients as it relates to pelvic floor function, how to engage their pelvic floor as a starting point, and then how to build on it. So I call this the functional Kegel. I decided to not even put it up on the slide because Kegel, if you've been in the interwebs lately, Kegel on social media has been getting slammed as a terrible thing, which I have so many problems with, but I'm going to unpack that for you in a minute. In short, the Kegel is some OBGYN from a long time ago. He slapped his name on the contraction, the concentric contraction of the pelvic floor. He called it Kegel, right? But as you guys know, muscle contraction is much more about than just about the shortening of tissue, right? We have lengthening under tension, shortening under tension. We have isometrics, holding under tension. And forgive me, I use my bicep a lot when it comes to pelvic floor analogy, just because you can see it, you can feel it. Everybody, when it flexes or relaxes, you can visualize what that happens. It's a lot easier to relate to than the pelvic floor. So I'll keep coming back to that. But so to take a little deeper dive here, this is my functional Kegel. And of course, I call it a functional Kegel because I'm not just including that shortening of the muscle fibers, like the flexion of the elbow in a bicep contraction. I'm also talking about the lengthening of those muscle fibers. And we know that any good, strong muscle has to be able to relax as well as it contracts, right? If you guys walk through your gym and you see somebody doing bicep curls that look like this, you're going to be like, oh God, they're missing out on a lot. They're leaving a lot on the table. They're going to end up really short and stiff, maybe some tenderness in there, right? Like nobody wants that. And the traditional Kegel is taught like this, right? And on top of it, it's taught like this with no resistance, no load. So you can imagine if on arm day, all the gym bros were just walking around like this, no load, just squeezing their elbows. Like that doesn't make any sense, right? So why then with our pelvic floors, do we think it's a good idea to sit at stoplights or commercials while we're watching our favorite TV show and just squeeze? I mean, I guess I will say I am like a forever skeptic, and even of my own information. So I will say potentially if you had like bicep surgery and it was like day one, this would be an appropriate exercise. But for the rest of us who can lift and carry our groceries and, do any other kind of compound movements in the gym, this is way too easy for our bicep. We're not going to load it or create any change or challenge. We have to go through the range of motion. We need load. Same thing for our pelvic floors. So now to bring some clarity to this picture that you guys are looking at. On the left side here, we have the inhale. When you inhale, your pelvic floor or the breath and the pressure down from your diaphragm as your diaphragm contracts and pushes down, increases the pressure in your abdomen. And your pelvic floor responds to that pressure by relaxing and lengthening and lowering. Okay. When you exhale, your diaphragm relaxes. The air comes out of your lungs, the diaphragm lifts up off of your abdomen, and pressure in your abdomen decreases. And your pelvic floor reacts to that by lifting and contracting or recoiling reflexively back up to neutral. This is the basis of what your pelvic floor does. And breath is something that we do all the time. Hopefully you guys have been breathing this entire conversation. I don't see anybody who looks blue, so that's good. But just like your breath, you can, if I say, okay, everybody take a deep breath in and hold it, you have conscious control of your breath. So it happens whether you know it's happening, and also you can override that, right? Same thing with your pelvic floor. Your pelvic floor is working all the time with every breath, relaxing and contracting. But also, if I want to engage with some conscious awareness there, I can teach you this functional Kegel: inhale, relax, exhale, contract, and lift. And now we can kind of affect the muscle tone in the pelvic floor. So from here, when I'm working with people, I teach them, and we're going to learn it in a second. I'll have you guys do it, but I teach them this as a basis. And then the world is my oyster, right? Gravity at baseline is a way to load your pelvic floor. Coughing, sneezing, laughing puts pressure down there. We're loading the pelvic floor more. And we can use this Kegel to contract, to brace, to handle that downward pressure that we might be putting on our pelvic floor. So if this sounds a little bit confusing, don't worry, because I have a lot of slides to break this down as we go. But let's do some functional Kegeling. So what I'm going to have you guys do is, if you're not sitting, maybe sit for a second, just because it's easier to kind of get your legs out of the way to feel this. I'm going to ask you to sit potentially on a soft surface, and I'm going to have you take your hands and sit on your hands. And I want you to feel for the bottom of your pelvis. You can kind of get the lay of the land down there with your fingertips. And what you're going to feel for first is those ischial tuberosities here and here, which are the two major bony protuberances of the bottom of your pelvis. All right. Ish tubes, sits bones, all the slang here because obviously when you're talking to your client, nobody cares. It's called the ischial tuberosity, but they might have heard sits bones in a yoga class, right? So these are the lateral borders of your pelvic floor. And if you take your fingertips now, because you're sitting on your hands, and you move them towards the middle a little bit and curl your fingertips around the inside of these sits bones, you're touching the very edge and outer of your pelvic floor. Okay. So this pelvis on the left here is a view of my pelvis, like looking straight at you. And this pelvis on the right is if you are above me looking down, like into my pelvis. All right. So this is, from this view, you can't see the ish tubes or the ischial tuberosities, but you can see the front and the back borders of your pelvis, which are the front and back borders of your pelvic floor. And what we're going to do, so if you're still sitting on your hands, we're going to take about a minute here to take a couple breaths and see if you can connect with that pelvic floor, and inhale, relax, exhale, contract that pelvic floor. All right. So before you even start, I'll have you kind of connect to your body as I'm talking here, breathing in and out through your nose, and just draw awareness to your breath. And on that, whenever you're ready, on that next inhale and see if you can kind of generate on your own a downward force, or let your pelvic floor relax into your fingertips. Another way to think about this is if you're trying to let out a fart. Yes, we're talking about farts here, people. For all adults, it's fine. Although when I was putting these slides together, my 6-year-old was really interested to know if I was going to put fart in the presentation. So not that kids can't partake in this, but okay. So the inhale, letting out a fart. The exhale, draw your pelvic floor up or hold in a fart. Okay, so you're just finishing with your clients, you feeling, maybe you just had lunch, it's, you're feeling some stuff, you're like, oh God, I gotta hold, we're not trying to fart in session. Or maybe you are, I don't know. What are you guys doing in here, Hunter? On virtual, I guess you can, right? You just hit that mute button and let her rip. I don't know.
That cue resonated.
All right, so, okay, so I'll let you guys continue with this, maybe do like 5 or so breaths, and I'm throw this one to you. Do you notice some feeling at your fingertips? That inhale, relax. Do you feel your pelvic floor like come into your fingertips on the inhale? Do you feel it lift off on the exhale? Or is it more the sensation that you feel? Do you feel like internally, like whether your fingers were there, you wouldn't notice, but you can kind of notice the engagement of the tissue of the pelvic floor itself as it lifts and contracts, and then as it lets go and relaxes. So I'm going to stop talking here for about 30 seconds. You guys can do maybe 5-ish or so of these. All right, and as you're wrapping up, anybody have any feedback on this? Because is this the first time anybody has ever attempted a Kegel? Has anybody ever done this before, practiced it? Is it what you expected? Feel free to share.
I mean, I never done that before, but holding in a fart and pushing out a fart resonates.
All right, good.
If
Yeah,
that's if
most
that's
people have some experience with that.
if that's the feeling I'm looking for, then yeah, I think I'm feeling what you're looking for me to do.
All right, perfect.
My question,
Um,
so
yeah,
my question would be, going off that point, like, one of the things that I've heard over time is that, like, it's not good to like hold in, like, let's say you have to go to the bathroom, like, right, you have to go number 2, right? It's not
yep,
good to hold that in, but like, uh is that, like, that's correct, right? You don't want to be like holding in, I guess, any
yep,
bodily function, right?
yep, yep. I mean, think about it. Like, if whenever we're talking about the pelvic floor, there's always some like weird awkwardness, taboo, like, I don't know, is this cool? But like, let's think about it like your bicep, right? Like, if you were like this all day long and you never straightened your elbow because you were constantly holding it and waiting too long to go, and then maybe you go so you get to relax for a second, and then as soon as you go back around whatever, you're here, how would your bicep feel at the end of the day?
So
Hot trash, right? So same thing with the pelvic floor. If you're constantly having to hold and you can't, like teachers, man, they have to, a lot of them don't get bathroom breaks. I know a lot of you coaches, if you go back to back to back sessions, right? Put those bathroom breaks in there, guys, for your pelvic floor sake. Yeah, so that's a really great question. Mary, you had another question?
How does constipation affect that? Are we going to talk about that?
Same, yeah, I mean, briefly, but same way. In short, you there's a few different things with constipation. I should say first, because we also have a dietitian in our practice, and it kind of bugs me a lot of time when people are so worried about the pelvic floor with constipation and there's not a major conversation about diet and GI stuff. So caveat, assuming that, you know, they're getting fiber that they need and their diet is good and they're hydrated and all of those things. If we're just thinking it's simply a mechanical restriction that's resulting in their constipation, then you can kind of think about that pelvic floor as they're constipated because in order to have a good healthy bowel movement, they have to be able to unflex that elbow. And again, if you can handle my elbow pelvic floor analogy, right? And they're here all the time. And when they need to make a big bowel movement, maybe they can only let go to here. So they literally, their pelvic floor is obstructing their ability to fully void or void comfortably. And there's usually a lot of other habits that they have that they don't realize related to the pelvic floor where they're holding tension, just like, again, to compare to a different muscle, like upper traps, right? People are always like this when they're super stressed. You see them, they walk around like this. So when they get to the gym, if you're going to train them, you're probably not going to do a lot of shoulder raises, like heavy trap bar, shoulder raises, because you're like, this person's already stressed, they're really loaded. So that's right. Something too to keep in consideration. And when we start talking about symptoms, because you're going to load pelvic floors, right? Gravity loads the pelvic floor. Standing with weight loads the pelvic floor. These are all things that are taken on in these tissues. And if we're have a hint or a notion from our client that they already are holding on to a lot of tension there, then the stuff that they do in the gym is also going to impact that as well.
Yeah, for sure. I work with a lot of, my main gig, I suppose, is probably more nutrition than training. And so I deal with a lot of
yes,
constipation, and it is a lot more probably to do with nutrition, but I was curious if, like from a stress perspective too, from that, like how does that affect the musculature? And then, I would imagine it
both
does.
ways. Yeah. So what I see when I'm thinking, I'm just, if you're talking diet with people, hopefully you're talking about poop, because that comes up, right? So pencil poops, where they're regular, they're going daily, twice a day or whatever is regular for them, but their poops are really narrow or thin, or they're regular but the shape is weird, then that to me, and again, they're hydrating, they have enough fiber, they're getting their vegetables and whatnot, then I'm thinking pelvic floor is the next thing on the list.
Interesting. Okay. None of them eat fiber, so that's where we start.
Yes.
But when we get them fiber that's still not there,
right,
then I'm about this avenue.
Exactly. We have to get things moving first. Yeah. And a lot of times that can also help with pelvic floor stuff too. So great question. All right. So we breathed, we Kegeled. We're going to talk about what you guys are what Mary's asking about, and maybe what you're thinking, some more symptoms that might be a hint that your client is dealing with pelvic floor dysfunction. So these are a list of symptoms where I'm just throwing them up there to kind of, so you guys can take those in. And if you're hearing these things, and it's probably going to be through conversation, right? Like I'm sure you guys don't ask much about your client's ability to orgasm on your first session, but maybe it might come up, right? Or tampons that fall out, or pain with sex, constipation, flatulence, leaking with urine is going to be the most common thing, but even that is not always a pelvic floor issue. There's urgency incontinence, which is like I am getting up to I've been gone all day and I don't have to pee, but as soon as I start to jingle my car keys to try to unlock my door to get in my house, all of a sudden, like I have to go really bad. I have to go right now, and I'm leaking as I run into the house, right? That's different compared to incontinence with exercise, which is called stress incontinence, which is anytime we have leaking, more or less due to overpowering of the pelvic floor, coughing, sneezing, laughing, jumping, running, where an action or activity or a strain of sorts overpowers the pelvic floor and we have leaking. Okay, so that's the one that we're mainly focused on here. I'm happy to talk about any of the other ones if you guys have questions, but for today, we got the incontinence focus. So this next slide is just a little bit of data, because I'd be remiss if I didn't include an actual study. I love data, but that's another story. So this is actually a study that was released just this month in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. And this I think is really important for you guys, because if you're not experiencing it, if you're not hearing it from your clients, it's happening. And I get that it's like kind of a touchy subject and you might not be hearing it from your clients. And the reason why, like, so we've got, just reading, these are direct quotes from the study. Survey responses revealed that 43% of female strength athletes experience SUI, which is strength urinary incontinence, during the day outside of their training. So they're not leaking with you, but they're leaking after. Which, what does that mean as it relates to the pelvic floor? That we fatigue the shit out of it and we're not recovering well, right? It's like if you're programming someone's running training, right? And they have their long day of marathon running and they do 20 miles in the morning, but they were like, oh shit, I forgot that I have family in town and I have to walk all around the city today. And by the end of the day, they're smoked. They can't stand up. They can't push the stroller to take their kids around or carry their kids or whatever. They're like, I got to lay down. And so that's a problem, right? Because we need to be programming their training in appropriate ways so that they can still handle the demands of their life. And if our pelvic floor, our training in the gym is overpowering our pelvic floor and we're having symptoms at the end of the day, that's a problem, right? And then the other one thing that I want to kind of draw your attention to, we've got people who are leaking during competition or during regular training, and it's as high as 59, almost 60%. So if you're sitting here and you're thinking of the clients that you work with and you're like, damn, I don't know anybody who ever leaks with the training that I do, then that means they're not telling you. It's happening. The other thing at the bottom here, that is probably why it's happening, is because only 9% seek treatment and only 60, almost 68% report that they thought it was normal. They thought that this was a desirable part of strength training. I'm like, so what? No big deal. So I'm here to tell you that leaking urine when you exercise is not normal, but it absolutely does not mean you are broken. This, most cases, is the same as if you load up somebody's squat, barbell back squat, and they're squatting and their knees are jutting forward. We're thinking, weak quads, right? I'm not going to tell that person never squat again. I'm going to say, we need some quad strengthening. You got too much weight on that bar. We need to scale back. Same thing when someone is leaking urine. They're overtraining, overpowering, whatever the tissue. They don't have the tissue tolerance to meet the demands of the task at hand. So this is an important thing, because often people don't understand that it's as simple as like, just do something else, bro. Like, this is not a stop running situation, or plyometrics aren't for you, or you can't get on the trampoline with your kids in the summertime. It's train the damn tissue, right? Like, we don't tell people never load. Sorry. Have you guys ever told that to your clients before? Like when they couldn't do a lift, or they couldn't, their grip fatigued in the kettlebell swing? You just pick a different exercise, right? So same thing here. Sorry, I get amped up about that one. Okay, so what causes leaking with exercise, or stress and incontinence? It's essentially, I'm already kind of hinting at it, it's a capacity versus demand issue. Their tissue tolerance is lower than the demand of the task at hand. And that can be the exercise we're doing right now, this rep, or it can be like in the culmination of the day or the week, because your pelvic floor doesn't get a break, right? When you're like, I'm looking at Kara here, who's holding George this whole time, right? Hi, baby George. So if she was your client, she trained with you all morning and you guys are doing a ton of plyos, and then Kara has to go home and, she doesn't have childcare and it's just her and the baby, and her husband's out of town this weekend. She's holding that baby all day long. And that's a pelvic floor challenge. That is a serious endurance pelvic floor challenge, right? So with exercise, whether it's we don't have enough capacity to meet the demands of the exercise, or the demand of the exercise is more than what we can tolerate, these are the two big pieces that we can look at when it comes to impacting leaking with exercise, and also training it. This is important because what you guys do in the gym with your clients can be directly impacting the pelvic floor. Meaning, this is skeletal muscle tissue, and fundamentally, skeletal muscle adapts to stimulus, adapts to load. And it adapts by whether, if that stimulus is just right, if that stimulus is in the sweet spot, it's going to adapt and get stronger, faster, more robust. But if that stimulus is too low, if we take all our leaky with exercise people and say, oh, don't ever jump again, guess what? Eventually they're going to start to leak when they're walking. Eventually they're going to leak when they're coughing, because they were not stressing and challenging this tissue, right? If we want adaptation, we need stimulus. So I just wanted to quickly talk about here a couple of these variables and how we can think about them. I put my good old bicep back up here. As a number one, I really hate the word weakness as it relates to the pelvic floor, because this is one of the most durable, strong, like, tissues in the body. I'm probably super biased when I say that, but it doesn't get a break. You're training your pelvic floor. When you're walking, you're training your pelvic floor. When you're breathing, you're training your pelvic floor. When you're yelling, right? The diaphragm has to contract harder to get more air out, and we're putting more force on that pelvic floor. So it's not weak. However, it might not be able to meet the demands of the task at hand. So that can come in the as it relates to strength. It can come in the as it relates to speed and reactivity. So if I have a strong bicep here, and I can't flex it quick enough in order to get my hand up here to catch a ball, I'm going to miss that pass. So if you have a strong pelvic floor and you cough or sneeze, it's a quick, fast, hard impact coming down onto your pelvic floor. If you have a strong pelvic floor, but it can't move fast enough, you're going to leak. There's no weakness there. And the endurance would be holding towards the end of the day. So somebody that might not leak during their short runs, they leak in their long runs or at the end of the day in general. And then lifestyle too. So thinking about what people are doing outside of the gym, like hanging out with baby George. A lot of this comes down to awareness, and I'm gonna teach you guys here in a second. I'm kind of skipping through all my favorite parts, but a little tool and trick to help with this. But I also want to speak to some of the variables on the demand side of that equation, because that's something that you guys have a big role to play in. Lifestyle habits, these are going to be things like Hunter was asking, like holding it all day long, not great for your pelvic floor. Use it bearing down or having to force a bowel movement, not great for your pelvic floor. Because that would be like if you're squatting and you're coming up out of the bottom of a squat, somebody just threw weight down on your back and you were like, whoa, come on, bro. Like, that's not cool, right? So overpowering the tissues when they're trying to contract or relax. Other lifestyle things, I'm going to kind of glaze through that because that's a talk for another time, but like squatty potties, great. Ladies, not hovering to pee is also important for your pelvic floor, because you're not able to, you're holding yourself up when you're hovering, right? Even on public toilets, lie in the toilet seat, don't hover, sit that booty down. This is important for being able to fully relax your pelvic floor. Training, how we can alter the demand on the pelvic floor. We want to be able to, one, establish tissue tolerance. What can they do without leaking? And then how can we manage the load that we're going to give them training so we can fit to that sweet spot, right? Not enough stimulus is not going to bring about any change, or not the right stimulus, because we know, like the SAID principle, with training specific adaptation for imposed demand. If I need to get my clients stronger, I need to give them strength resistance training, high loads, low reps in the activities that are related to their goals, right? But if I need to work athleticism and speed and reactivity, the movements that I choose are going to be entirely different. Same thing with pelvic floor. So if they're leaking with plyos, but they're really good with their long runs, these are different variables that we're looking to train. Speed and reactivity versus endurance. All right, so over here, we've got some training load variables. The list on the left here, these are your standard training load variables for any, when you're looking to, at what variables you can monitor or change for what specific outcome as it relates to any exercise, right? Intensity, frequency, duration, volume, tempo, and recovery is a big one because sometimes just a little longer rest between reps or sets is enough to decrease the demand of the load on the pelvic floor, and they'll be able to execute okay. And then, of course, exercise selection. And here on the right, I threw some things up here. This is arguably a top-down, easiest to hardest challenge to the pelvic floor list. So if you're having somebody who upright with exercise, you could even call this, your runners have an element of gravity, an element of plyos happening in here. So we need to get them not gravity. So what does not gravity look like? Sitting here upright, my rib cage is stacked over my pelvis. I'm bearing the weight of gravity for my whole torso, but in a plank, I'm not, right? I'm horizontal. So my pelvic floor doesn't have to carry the load of my entire torso. So if you guys were doing the first functional Kegel breath work, and you having really hard time connecting, couldn't really figure it out, I'd be like, all right, let's lay on your back and start there. Because already I'm actually giving you a loaded exercise just to sit and breathe. And the other thing I didn't say, but I think it's worth mentioning on that same front is just the same way when you, back to our bicep, when you flex and extend your bicep, this flexed position, this straightened position, if holding no weight, just flexing and bending your arm out here in space, if you close your eyes and I said, okay, what do you feel working while you flex and extend your elbow? You'd be like, I don't know, like, I guess I feel like my shirt on my arm. Like, what do you mean? What muscles do I feel when I do that? I don't really feel it, but it's working the bicep, right? But if I were to give you a 20-pound weight or a kettlebell and I said, okay, now with that kettlebell flex and extend, what muscle do you feel? You'd be like, bicep, easy, no brainer, right? This is the same thing with my functional Kegel, just breathing and standing. It's actually totally normal not to feel too much there because the degree to which your pelvic floor is going to work should always match the challenge at hand, right? Just like this bicep curl here. If I'm not holding any weight, I don't want my bicep to be like, that's not very functional. If I need to move quick, that bicep's not going to be able to do it if it's fully contracting with every movement. So same thing with your pelvic floor. So therefore, sometimes too, if I teach someone the functional Kegel and they can't feel anything, then I throw them a kettlebell and we're standing and breathing or squatting or holding different positions. And that can really help them to engage more with those tissues and feel more with those tissues. So load is not always, or deloading is not always a regression, and loading is not always a progression when it comes to this. All right, last thing here before I break for some questions is blow before you go. So this is my tool to help with, it's kind of like a catch-all for leaking with exercise. I got this from a physical therapist who's also a researcher and just really amazing for the pelvic floor, pelvic health world. Her name's Julie Wiebe, and she's a physical therapist. She just, I think, started teaching for Michigan University, if I'm correct, or someplace up in Michigan. But she's also a researcher. She also works with clients. She's got a great blog and YouTube that's probably a little old by now. Maybe, and by old, I mean like 5 years. Because since she switched to research, she's mostly been diving into that, but she's awesome. This concept is from her. And this is essentially the idea that, remember from my functional Kegel, your exhale blowing out is a contract and a lift of your pelvic floor. And that contract and lift is kind of like bracing the muscle before, in this case, blow before you go, and brace the muscle before you use it, right? So I like to think of, if you're having, or your client is having trouble with leaking, with coughing, sneezing, laughing, jumping, right? If you teach them to exhale at when that impact, that cough, that sneeze, that laugh, or that landing, because that's when the impact is in jumping, and though it's challenging on the pelvic floor, if you have them blow and contract their pelvic floor a little bit and kind of brace for impact, it can help them to tolerate the challenge of that stimulus. So blow before you go. It's a little bit like, if I was a football player walking down the field and I don't see somebody coming and I just get blindsided, I'm going to be wrecked, right? But if I see someone coming and they're about to tackle me and I can give a little feedback into them, I'm going to absorb the force of that contact much better. Same thing with your pelvic floor. So when you feel, you could tell them, or you could tell them, just have them exhale. You don't have to tell them that this is, engage your pelvic floor and da 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 da. Exhale when your feet hit the ground when you're jumping. Exhale as you feel like that sneeze is about to happen, as opposed to the people who sneeze like this. Oh! Man, I actually just popped my ears. So I really demonstrated well, but they're not letting that air out. So the blow before you go gets the contraction of the pelvic floor, but it also gives an escape for that energy to go, which this also connects back to a big debate. What about breath holding with training? What about Valsalva? What about breathing and bracing? When do you breathe during the exercise? Exhale on the hard part of the exercise, because that is going to get them to engage their pelvic floor reflexively. And again, you don't have to go down the rabbit hole. Just make sure that the exhale is happening there. And if you're working with someone to specifically manage their leaking, then you can teach them the inhale, relax, exhale, contract, and kind of teach them to connect that pelvic floor awareness to the breath. And then after that, once they've got that connection, you just apply the breath to the hard part of the exercise. If I'm having somebody who's leaking with exercise, I'm never having them breath hold. Okay. Why? Because the exhale alone is going to give a leak, an energy leak for that abdominal pressure, that pressure management that we were talking about. It gives it a place to go. If they bear down, they're challenging the pelvic floor, and then there's no breaks, there's no rest, there's no downtime. So it's only downward force onto that pelvic floor. And if they have the capacity, if that pelvic floor has the strength to meet the demands of that task, fucking awesome. Great. But if it doesn't, if they're leaking, then that's problems, right? And we can think about it again, like, is leaking bad? No, but it's a sign that we're overtraining, we're poorly programming for them, and they're not recovering well, or they're not handling the demand of that task. So we need to switch gears so that we can make sure we get to that sweet spot with the challenge, and that we can give them an adaptable stimulus. And after that, guys, when you match the demand of the task up with the tissue tolerance, the sky's the limit. So jumping and Valsalva during 1 rep maxes and bearing down, if you can handle it, awesome, do it, train it. But if they're leaking, we need to scale back, we need to shift, we need to change some variables. So, all right, that's the end, you guys. That's all I have for you in terms of slides today. So I don't know if anybody had any questions, but I'm happy to take them. This is how you can reach me if you have any questions or any clients. I work all the time too, virtually. In fact, it's one of the virtues of being like a pelvic floor therapist who I'm not a physical therapist, so I don't do internal exams. I only use education and exercise with people. So I don't need to touch their pelvic floors to see if they're engaged. It's the same way if somebody comes to you guys and says, hey, I want to train and get strong and get a bigger booty. You don't have to touch their butt to see if they're engaging the tissue, right? Like hopefully you can teach them that. So same thing from my perspective. And then also I'm going to be hosting a virtual workshop, pelvic floor workshop for trainers and coaches, likely sometime towards the end of October. So if you're interested in that, shoot me an email or hit me up on Instagram to shoot me a DM so I can have your name and contact info and we can stay in touch. And we'll go from there.
All right. Can I say something, Laura, real quick before we
Yeah.
Well, thank you profusely because I think it's a good time for questions. So if I were to say, because I think this is actually, it's especially important in this context, but actually important in a lot of contexts, building confidence as a coach. So you would say that somebody leaks after trying a plyometric or bouncing, right? Your approach is not the bouncing is bad and they should stay away from the bouncing. Your approach is if they don't do the bouncing down the line, actually, they will be less prepared for other activities that are of less.
Absolutely.
So what we need to figure out is where their capacity is now, meet them where they're at, and slowly inch up their ability to build capacity so that they can handle those higher level activities down the line. Because I know for a fact, me as a coach, the first time somebody leaked when I had them do a plyo, I instantly thought, oh shit, did I break them? And is this not for them? And should we stay away from it? Which I'm sure a lot of people can identify with. But it's the same, that's an important, in my opinion, shift. Okay, I'm not too worried about it. That was a little too much right now, but what's the plan going to be to build you there, right? I think
exactly.
That's an important takeaway for people. I got that from this talk, you talking and leading that in. So I wanted to say thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I tell people all the time, it's something that it's taboo. Half the time your clients are going to leak and not even tell you, right? But if you can change your mindset about it, and like I've had my own struggles with it. I've had 3 vaginal births, and on that front too, like 85% of people with uteruses are going to have babies, right? And of that 85%, 70% of those are going to be vaginal birth, and of that 70%, something like 80% of that are going to have muscle tears of their perineum during birth. So back to my bicep analogy, a torn bicep. And if you're somebody who's teaching plyos, it's like teaching bicep curls on a torn bicep. And if you're working someone, especially if they're newly postpartum and they haven't, like the best of the best rehab and postpartum exercise advice is to slowly go back to activity. That's what we do in this country. We have no care. We have no plan. There's no organized set of exercises or direction. And then we're also taking a person, I didn't even comment on the sleep deprivation and what that does for muscle performance. And if you're nursing, the caloric changes. And Mary, you mentioned you deal with nutrition, so I'm sure you see that sometimes with people too, like fueling for exercise, but also what about fueling for breastfeeding and exercise? Like this is a lot, you guys. But if we think about the tissue specifically, and remember that it's skeletal muscle tissue and by definition is adaptable. And if we as exercise professionals, fitness professionals can, just like we do a squat, right? If I go to hand somebody 50 pound kettlebell for a goblet squat and they like get lost down there or they're like way hunched over, I'm not going to say, oh great, keep going with that, we're going to add more weight. No, we gotta wait a minute, you're not tolerating that well, I can see by your form, right? But also if their form looks like trash or they come back to me and they like, oh my god, I had DOMS for 7 days after our workout last time, I'm not going to pat myself on the back with that either. I'm going to say we got to change something, but I'm also not going to say no goblet squats for you ever. I need to understand what their tissue tolerance, what their capacity, what variable their lacking? And then what tool am I going to use to target that in that sweet spot?
Drop that mic. That was awesome.
Laura, can I add something real quick, just from like a personal standpoint, working with you, plus now being like also being a coach? Going through Hunter's level 1, I've leaked more than I care to admit, and it's really embarrassing. It's really frustrating. It's like, what's the word I'm looking for? The opposite of
Humbling?
empowering.
Humbling?
Yes, but it's like the opposite of empowering. Like it
feels
feels
shame.
It feels like shit. It feels shameful, right? And so
Yeah.
when I first really leaked, I contacted Hunter and I contacted Laura and I said, I need a modification. This is super embarrassing, but I don't want to quit. So finding that modification where I was still doing jumps, I was still doing pogos, was incredibly empowering in a time where I'm consistently overwhelmed, and finding something that I can do and do it well without saying like, oh, you can't do this, because there's a lot I can't do right now in terms of life. And so let's find something that you can do and then grow from there. And that's been incredibly empowering, incredibly beneficial. So from a personal standpoint, like my son is 11 months old. And I am sleep deprived. I am still breastfeeding, all the things, all the above. From a client standpoint, to find that tolerance level for a client is like, I cannot tell you how valuable that is. Just everyone is, from like just a personal anecdote working with Laura, going through Hunter's program. It's so important to find that level for that client, especially when it comes to leaking, because it's been considered such a shameful thing. So
yeah. And fundamentally, that's what you guys are doing, right? You're teaching your clients what they didn't think they could already do, right? Like when Hunter says, pick up a weight that scares you. How does that feel when you crush it, right? Same, except for all of us who's birthed a baby, that trampoline is a little bit scary. Those plyos are a little bit scary. Even if you've done all the things and you've rehabbed and you've kegeled at a red light, which is like the standard of care for pelvic floor prep for birth. Which hopefully now you guys know that that's a little silly. We need to train it a little better than that. So, yeah.
All right, guys. Does anybody else have one more question they want to ask before we sign off here today?
I have a question. What if like the other end, like you're almost like too tense to the point where like say some, like I know you mentioned before with like if someone's really overloaded with the stress, they're gonna come into intense. But like what kind of, then I would think that you would need to work on like relaxation exercise. Like what exercise to like work with the people that are too tense?
Yep, great question. So fundamentally, back to that breathing exercise and an example, the inhale, relax, the exhale, contract. So I'm taking the exhale, I'm not teaching the contract at all. And I am teaching on them finding the inhale in that relax between reps or between whatever, between sets, or maybe before and after the workout. I'm a minimum effective dose person, and I think it's pretty invasive to like, especially if you're doing like a HIIT training or something, and like each rep you have to pause and breathe and inhale and relax, like, or potentially maybe a HIIT training is not a great starting point for somebody who's having those kind of symptoms. But teaching them to be able to relax. 2, a deep squat is equal to the straight elbow. It is the lengthened pelvic floor position. So deep squats, really hingy deadlifts, deep hinges, those are all things that's going to put naturally the pelvic floor in a lengthened position. Happy baby pose, child's pose, if they can't hold a squat or hold it under load, or for whatever reason they have tight ankles or stiff upper back and they can't get into a deep squat. If they're into a deep squat on their toes, that's fine, because I don't give a shit about what their feet are doing. I'm doing this for the pelvic floor, right? So these are just some things that you can consider. And what this looks like for people is they'll have urinary urgency symptoms, frequency. So they'll like have to pee before the training session. They'll be like, oh, sorry, I have to go run and pee in the middle of the session, or right at the end, or when you're trying to talk to them to reschedule the next session. They have to go a lot. Vulvodynia is the medical word for it, but they'll have like painful vulvar symptoms, which they probably won't tell you about. They won't wear tampons because they can't insert a tampon comfortably. Penetrative sex is uncomfortable. Those are all symptoms that you would hear from somebody who has tight pelvic floor symptoms. And also these symptoms would be worse with asymmetrical movements. So lunges, split squats, those would be harder because that asymmetrical stance has higher demand for balance and pelvic stability, which the pelvic floor plays a role on. So if we're taking that tight muscle, so to go back to the bicep, right? And I'm like maxed out on my bicep curl, and then somebody throws more weight on me, go well, right? And then that tight muscle, bike seats are going to feel like hot garbage for these people, because especially a narrow bike seat is going to essentially push up on the pelvic floor, holding it in the contracted position, right? Like if you train hard upper body all day and your arms are smoked, the last thing you want to do is be like this for a long period of time, because you're going to be like, oh God, I just want to like let my arms go, right? Same thing. That's what a bike seat is doing this to an overtrained pelvic floor. So they're going to feel better with a wide bike seat, or it's just sitting in general might be terrible, and they would do better with a donut seat, because that space in the middle is going to allow for lengthening, some relaxation of the pelvic floor. So these are like, again, more lifestyle sort of things, but just kind of painting that picture of what you guys might hear or see related to that. And that's what I'm hoping to talk about more when I do this workshop, is we're going to take a deeper dive into basically the biomechanics stuff as it relates to the pelvic floor, and the pieces that we can train and implement. So if you're dealing with someone with a leaky pelvic floor, is it because they lack strength? So they can only do a 5-pound bicep curl. They gas out after 10 pounds, but demands of their life needs them to be able to do 20 pounds for reps. Or they lack speed, which is a plyometric issue. They can do that 20 pounds, no problem, but it's slow. And when they're down here and they need to quickly contract, they're too slow, too late, right? Or is it super contracted and we're here and this is what their bicep curl looks like? They're not letting go enough. And these are all things, just like if I was purely talking about biceps, right? You guys have tools, have exercise that can challenge the strength, the reactivity, the endurance of these tissues. Because at the end of the day, we're all talking about muscle tissue, skeletal muscle tissue, which is fundamentally adaptable. So there you have it. Does that answer your question there, Christine?